The U.S. government collected over $80 billion in tariff revenue in 2023 alone, enough to fund massive stimulus programs. But what if the president used that money to send every American a $2,000 check without asking Congress first? Today, I'll explain the $2,000 tariff stimulus plan like you're five. By the end, you'll understand why this viral promise sounds amazing, but faces legal, financial, and logistical nightmares. Here's what nobody tells you about presidential power and money. It's far more limited than campaign promises suggest. Ever wonder why presidents can't just hand out cash whenever they want? The Constitution gives Congress, not the president, control over spending. Article 1 explicitly states that no money leaves the Treasury without congressional approval. This isn't a suggestion or tradition. It's the most fundamental check on executive power. When you hear promises about direct payments from tariff revenue, you're hearing about a process that legally requires legislation. Those laws let presidents impose tariffs for national security or unfair trade practices without new votes. But here's the critical distinction. Collecting money through tariffs doesn't give the president power to spend it. That revenue goes into the General Treasury Fund. Every dollar that enters must be appropriated by Congress before it can leave. Some argue that during a declared national emergency, a president might redirect funds using statutes like the National Emergencies Act. But direct cash payments to citizens? That's never happened without congressional authorization. The CARES Act stimulus in 2020 required a full legislative process. The 2008 stimulus checks under Bush required legislation. Even the 2001 tax rebate checks came from a law Congress passed. There's zero modern precedent for unilateral presidential stimulus payments. Legal scholars across the political spectrum agree. Trying to issue checks without Congress would trigger immediate lawsuits. The Congressional Budget Office would likely declare it unconstitutional spending. Courts would probably issue injunctions within days. Now let's talk about the actual money, because the math gets ugly fast. Here's the part that changes everything. Tariff revenue sounds huge until you do basic arithmetic on a national scale. What if I told you $80 billion divided among eligible Americans equals far less than advertised? Let's break down the numbers. The U.S. has roughly 260 million adults. If you sent every single adult $2,000, you'd need $520 billion. That's more than 6 times the total annual tariff revenue. Even if you only targeted the 145 million taxpayers, you'd still need $290 billion, over 3 times available tariff money. Economists estimate that tariff costs get passed to consumers at rates of 80 to 100%. You'd essentially be taking money from Americans through higher prices to give it back through checks. Here's what's wild. Historical tariff revenue has never been stable or predictable enough for guaranteed entitlement spending. Modern entitlement programs require trillions in stable funding. Social Security costs over $1.2 trillion yearly. But now you're back to needing Congress to define eligibility rules, income thresholds, dependent qualifications, and payment schedules. You can't administer complex means-tested benefits through executive order alone. The IRS needs clear statutory authority to access tax returns and determine who qualifies. Privacy laws prevent the executive branch from unilaterally accessing and distributing based on personal financial data. You'd need legislation just to establish the administrative framework. That's the real game changer. Even creative funding schemes crash into administrative and legal walls that require legislation. This leads us to who actually pays tariffs, because that lie keeps getting repeated. Now here's what most people miss. Tariffs aren't taxes on foreign countries. They're taxes on American importers. Why does this confusion persist despite every economist explaining otherwise for decades? When the U.S. imposes a 25% tariff on Chinese steel, the Chinese company doesn't write a check to the U.S. Treasury. Instead, the American company importing that steel pays the tariff to U.S. Customs. The tariff cost flows through to American consumers and businesses buying the products. Study after study confirms this. A 2019 analysis of washing machine tariffs found that prices increased almost dollar for dollar with the tariff amount. China didn't pay a cent. It just exported less to the U.S. and more to other countries. So when politicians claim foreign nations will fund stimulus checks, they're either ignorant or lying. The money comes from Americans through a hidden consumption tax. Plot twist. Those industries employ far more workers than steel production does. So tariffs might save 1,000 steelworker jobs, while increasing costs for companies employing 100,000 workers in steel-consuming industries. Here's the crazy part. If you did somehow get a $2,000 tariff-funded stimulus check, you might simultaneously be paying $2,500 more annually. You'd get a one-time $2,000 payment while paying $2,000 to $3,000 more per year in perpetuity for groceries, electronics, and clothing. Which brings us to whether Congress would ever actually pass this if forced to vote on it. Here's how it all connects. Political promises without implementation plans are just expensive fantasies that rarely survive reality. What does this mean for the actual likelihood of $2,000 tariff checks reaching your bank account? Even if a president wanted this desperately, he'd need congressional cooperation. Getting 218 House votes and 60 Senate votes for a massive new spending program is brutally difficult. Republicans traditionally oppose deficit spending and new entitlements. Democrats oppose regressive taxation like tariffs that hit lower-income families hardest. Now check this out. Past stimulus packages passed during acute crises, financial collapse in 2008, pandemic in 2020. The political logic falls apart without crisis conditions. Stimulus as an economic tool makes sense during downturns. It boosts demand when private spending collapses. Economists across the spectrum would oppose poorly timed stimulus for these reasons. Here's the bottom line. International trade partners wouldn't sit idle while the U.S. dramatically raised tariffs. Political coalition building requires keeping business support, which evaporates the moment tariffs threaten profits. So you'd simultaneously face international retaliation, domestic business opposition, moderate congressional skepticism, and economist warnings. That's why this matters. The policy might win applause at rallies, but it dies in the legislative process. So here's the full picture. A president cannot legally issue stimulus checks without Congress. Tariff revenue doesn't generate enough money to fund $2,000 per person without massive eligibility restrictions. Tariffs function as taxes on American consumers, not foreign countries, meaning Americans would fund their own checks through higher prices. And Congress likely wouldn't pass the necessary legislation due to opposition from moderates, economists, and business interests facing international retaliation. The promise sounds amazing until you examine the constitutional law, the arithmetic, the economic incidence, and the political reality. It's a viral talking point that collapses under scrutiny. Could creative legal arguments stretch executive authority further than we've seen before? Possibly, but courts would intervene fast. Could future tariff increases generate more revenue? Yes, but at massive cost to consumers and economic efficiency. Could Congress theoretically pass this with the right crisis and political alignment? Maybe, but that scenario requires conditions that don't currently exist. The real question isn't whether we could design such a program, but whether the costs outweigh the benefits. Giving Americans $2,000, funded by policies that cost them $3,000 in higher prices, isn't smart economics. And legal shortcuts around congressional spending authority threaten constitutional separation of powers that protect us from executive overreach. So what do you think? Is tariff-funded stimulus creative problem-solving, or economic illiteracy wrapped in political pandering? Drop your take below, especially if you think the math works, or if you've got creative solutions.